Hello, my name is Noah Gibbs, and today I'll be screencasting my normally in-person presentation, Rack Middleware with any framework. Rack is the lowest level Ruby web API. All of the standard Ruby web packages, you can see the logos for Rails, Sinatra, Grape, Cramp. There are others like RocketPants, for instance. All of them use this API. Better yet, you can usually mix and match them. You can think of it as a kind of flexible CGI layer for Ruby if you've used CGI. You can't ask questions throughout this presentation, but if you want to email me, my address is at the end. I am very happy to hear your questions. So Rack, being a CGI-like low-level web interface, is implemented by every application server. I mentioned Thin, Unicorn, Goliath. There are many others like Puma or Trinidad. Is implemented by the application server so that any application server can handle your application, and it's normally implemented by your web framework, though your application can also implement it directly. That way, any of the various frameworks can talk to any of the app servers, more or less. A Rack application, this is something your framework would normally do for you, is potentially any object that can accept .call. You can see here that this is a very simple application. We're just taking an object and defining .call on it, just that one individual instance, and all it's really doing is returning a 200, that's an HTTP success, a content type, and the content. Of course, Ruby proc accepts .call, which means that this function is exactly the same as the one you saw a moment ago. We created an object with object.new and defined app.call. Proc does that for us. There's the HTTP status code. 200 is standard normal success. Here's the content type. Newer versions of Rack allow you to not specify this, but in case you're using an older version, I recommend putting it in at least to check. And of course, here's your content. If you run this in your application server and point a browser to it, you'll see Hello World. A framework generally uses what's called a rackup file, which allows you to create one of these objects and then run it. You can see what goes in your framework file right now. If you have a config.ru file and you have Rack installed, you can usually just type rackup. That will use whatever Rack-compatible web server is available in your gem file, and it'll run your application. That's how you would get it running on a port, so that you can point a browser at localhost and that port number and see Hello World. In a few cases, for instance, if you're using Unicorn or another server that doesn't directly have a Rack adapter, you may need to run start specific to that app server, like Unicorn uses the command to Unicorn. Now, middleware starts with this simple single object, which handles everything, but it can also wrap your object in multiple layers. For instance, in this case, content type text HTML could take some time to type. Instead, you can use one of these middleware layers. In this case, Rack content type. We'll see that you are returning something that could be HTML, and it will set the content type for you automatically, saving you having to type out the content type every time. You can see that that hash, the second argument, is now empty. Every Ruby framework allows using config.ru. There are a few older frameworks that don't default to it. In general, at this point, everything uses config.ru. You're very unlikely to write a new application that doesn't. So, what can you do with this middleware? We've been building up through what a Rack application is, and we've started talking about middleware. We did name the talk after middleware. What's middleware do? The Rack middleware in the Rack gem itself that you get automatically the moment you install it can do basic authentication. That's HTTP basic authentication, as well as digest authentication. It can statically serve files and directories in ways compatible with major web servers. When I say merge multiple apps, what I specifically mean is that very often you want to break up the different directories of your site and have them do different things. Some of them should serve static files, like your public directory, while others may run any of these or your own application, or 3 or 4 of your own applications in 3 or 4 different directories. There's a cute built-in piece of middleware that prints out a little ASCII art lobster. If you haven't seen it, it's worth one Google search to have a look. It's called the Rack Lobster. And of course, lots of little utility things like content type, which we saw earlier, as well as simple caching. Make sure gzip compression is on for that connection, and a number of other things. There are also many third-party middleware gems. You don't get them automatically when you install the Rack gem, but you can install them for themselves. HTTP caching is one example, and you get a lot of configuration ability. Many different kinds of caching are available, but of course it is an HTTP framework, so the different kinds of caching are all, in one way or another, HTTP caching. ChromeFrame, in this case specifically requiring your application to use ChromeFrame or automatically allowing it to be installed. Rate limiting, in this case, simply means making sure that your application is only handling some fixed number of maximum requests per second, and it's easy to write your own Rack middleware to do custom rate limiting if you want to. I say authentication. In this case, authentication beyond HTTP basic. Usually for authentication you want to have a full account system and lots of configurability. Devise is a fine example of that for Rails. Warden is a similar and much simpler system for Rack. When I say monitoring and Rack-a-mole, I'm referring to hooking your application up to MongoDB and automatically sending information about every request, substantial amounts of information about every request into that, or of course you can store it in other ways. The nice thing about each of these pieces of third-party middleware that I've mentioned is that it's a really easy install into your application, where we said to use the content type extension. Well, once you're using one of those third-party gems in your gem file, you add a use declaration in exactly the same way, add parameters if it has any, and then you're good to go. Whatever it is you've installed is now working. So we talked about middleware. Rack endpoints are the things that middleware modifies. If middleware changes the content type, it has to change the content type on something. So when you declared a procedure early on and you called run on it, that was a Rack endpoint. Frameworks can use endpoints. For instance, your Rails application will happily arrange 3 or 4 different endpoints that you write and route to them, the same way that it routes to your controllers. In fact, in Rails, every controller action is a small freestanding Rack application. Some libraries, like Yard, which is a documentation tool, and Gem-in-a-Box, which is a gem server, provide a Rack endpoint as what they do. That is to say, you can take that Rack endpoint and you can change its content type, or you can add authentication. In fact, for Gem-in-a-Box, if you want to make sure that only internal users on your intranet are receiving gems from your gem server, you just take that and then you wrap it in standard authentication. In this case, you would generally want to use HTTP basic authentication because it's easy, and then make sure that it's all done over HTTPS because HTTP basic authentication is not secure. So, we'll look quickly at exactly that. Here is Gem-in-a-Box, and you'll see that you require it as a gem. You set its settings there with gem-in-a-box.data equals, and then by using the Rack authentication basic, that's HTTP basic authentication, you can set up, there we are, in that case it's hard-coding the password as your massively secure password. I recommend you change it. And then by running the endpoint, we've made sure that we have the basic authentication around the Gem-in-a-Box endpoint, again the gem server that you want to secure. RubyMetrics, for instance, provides both, that is to say, both middleware and an endpoint. And of course, anything that you do can supply middleware, or can supply an endpoint, or can supply both. That just means that sometimes you want to serve the content directly, which an endpoint does, and sometimes you want to modify somebody else's. But either way, it's a nice commodity way to handle it, and just exactly like Gem-in-a-Box lets you use the third-party middleware and the third-party software, but configure it yourself in the way you want it. This is a great way to ship your library in the most general possible way. So let's talk about why. One of the advantages of building in Rack and building using Rack middleware is low overhead. What I mean by that is that there's a good chance someone else has already written the gem. You don't need to do a lot of configuring it. It's very easy to drop it in, just a few lines of code. One line in your gem file, and often one line in your config.ru, which you already have. Again, whatever framework you're using already uses config.ru. you have a lot of control in most cases. Not only do you have the source code, and the source code is usually very short and very simple, but a good gem, a good piece of middleware is already very configurable, and so mostly you just need to pass arguments through. And when I say works everywhere, I specifically mean that it works on any application server, and it works on any framework. If you write a piece of Rack middleware and ship it, Sinatra folks can use it, Rails folks can use it, every one of those libraries that we talked about earlier, and many more, can use it. Rails takes Rack far beyond what I just talked about. That means not only do you have a config.ru and you can use it in exactly the way we talked about, but Rails supplies chances to put in Rack endpoints all through the routing table in all of your actions, and within a given controller you can actually insert one or more parts of Rack middleware. They also give you access to Rack's own middleware stack, and you can remove things, put them in. Rack is basically a stack, Rails is basically a stack of stacks of stacks of Rack middleware. And so once you understand Rack, a lot of Rails makes more sense. If you want to learn Rack, I do have a very simple build-a-framework that is a Rack framework and does use config.ru and handles the basic things we talked about early on in just the free chapters. You trade me your email address and you'll get the chapters without any problem. There is also an introduction to Rack in the free email class that you receive when you give me your email address. In the full book, we go into far more detail, including building Rack middleware. And, of course, there's also a lot of podcasts, screencasts. The internet is full of free information, and if you Google for Rack, generally Ruby Rack, the word Rack is not very specific, but if you Google for Ruby Rack, you'll find a lot of good introductions to all of these topics. So, my email address is noah_gibbs@yahoo.com. I hope you'll send me any questions that you have. It would be lovely to hear from you. I write the Rails book partly because I really like hearing from Rails programmers, and I believe that everyone should learn Ruby, should learn the basics of Ruby web frameworks, and not everyone needs to know Rails, but I'm a big fan of people knowing it well when they know it. Oh, and my current employer, OnLive, is hiring Rubyists. Specifically, my group is looking for a good generalist Rubyist right at the moment I make this screencast. I am sure they would be very, very happy to hear from you if you were a Rubyist looking for work. Thank you very much.